first up, of course, we have Jeremy Couillard, who was educated as a painter, but Couillard is a self-taught new media artist who has made numerous well-received and internationally exhibited video, virtual reality, and video game works, accompanied by installations, paintings, and various ephemera. His work often deploy humorous narratives about future dystopias to explore what motivates us as humans to work, live, and create. Jeremy was born in 1980 in Michigan, where he received his MFA in Columbia University and his BA from Michigan State University. He has exhibited at Zablutovich Collection, Phillips Auction House, Denny Dimon Gallery, Yours, Mine, and Ours Gallery, Lincoln Center, the Louis B. James, Zulon Gallery, amongst many others. We're so excited to have Jeremy here with us today. Enjoy the presentation. We'll be back for some conversation afterwards.
Okay. Hello, Internet, and thank you, Gray Area, for having me be part of this really amazing lineup of artists and writers. I'm really excited to be included in this, and I hope you enjoy my presentation here. My name is Jeremy Couillard. I'm an artist and teacher based in New York, and lately I've been making video games or simulations and building installations around them as my art practice. I like thinking about a lot of different things, from what it means to be human, about humor, science fiction, computers, surrealism, aliens, anarchy, consciousness, and video games. This is my game Fuzz Dungeon that was released in June, and I'm going to play through a few levels for you here and just sort of go off on some tangents. I've been wanting to attempt this artist talk format for a while, as opposed to the normal slide presentation I would do. This seemed like a really good moment to try it out. Right now I'm in the central dungeon area of the game, and these buildings around me are all different levels that you can go into, so I'll go in this one here. I'm going to check out 3 or 4 levels. They sort of move through periods in human history in a very loose way, but I'm going to choose some that kind of fit with the things I want to talk about. Probably the main thing that I was exploring or thinking about while making this game was the sort of surrealist idea of the subconscious expressing itself through an almost automatic world building we're doing every day in our heads, and how that comes out in day-to-day life. But I was taking it a little bit further, trying to really look at those mental visualizations as if they were real, in the same way when I look at something in the physical world. You know, we get such clear pictures in our heads of things, but when we try and get them out or perform them, they're always so skewed and goofy. You know, for example, something easy is like the music I grew up listening to. It's in my head all the time, and I hear it so perfectly. But the few times I've tried something like karaoke, I pick a song from the 90s or something like that, and when I try to sing it, it comes out in a disastrous way, you know, that says more about my psyche and shortcomings and insecurities than the thing I'm actually trying to reproduce. And that's what I call a fuzz dungeon. It's that awkward space between the vision that's in your head and the thing you do in real life is a result of that vision. And I think this has broad applications, from seeing Mickey Mouse perfectly in your head and drawing some chimeric mutant that doesn't look anything like Mickey Mouse, to seeing a utopian way to organize a society and then getting something instead like a neoliberal bureaucracy that can't even provide basic things like housing and healthcare. In this level, the protagonist is a farmer whose crops end up looking like and doing not what you would think when you plant seeds. The crops interact with that shaman there that's on its throne, replenishing your seeds. I wasn't trying to make a real farm by any stretch of the imagination. I looked at a few Google images of Neolithic farms and shamans, and after that I had an image in my head of what some sort of ancient mystical farm setup might look like, and then I put it together based on that. It passed through the fuzz dungeon in my head and came out not looking anything like the images that I was looking at, the reference images, but it did look like the inside of my head after looking at those images. And, you know, I guess also I think it's really funny that anyone would have a farm inside of a cave. For some reason that reminds me of the thing that happens when you fall asleep while you're reading. You dream sometimes that you're still reading, and it feels so real, like you can really read with your eyes closed. The idea of something feeling true is pretty interesting to me. Let's see. I like this very short video game manifesto by a collective called Arcane Kids. One of the bullet points from the manifesto says that the fastest way to the truth is through a joke. And this is something I keep in mind a lot when I'm working. I have very serious intentions when I work, but I don't want my stuff to be taken too seriously. I don't want to pretend that I have any solutions or answers to anything, just questions and analogies. This sense of not being taken too seriously is something I really like about the video game space. Video games were the first things that I thought were beautiful before anyone tried to teach me what beauty was. This level has a sort of goofy and kind of melancholic vibe. I really like that poetic term, memory palace. And I know it's a technique to help us remember things by visualizing them in your head, but I wanted to make an actual sort of palace or tower for nostalgia instead of memory, which is sort of funny because being nostalgic is not something we need help with, but remembering things correctly definitely is. Let's see. This kind of interior mental world building that we're doing, it's, I think in part to protect us from reality and to keep us comfortable to some extent. Sometimes we don't want to remember things as they really happen, and it's hard to see other things and ourselves too as they really are or were. Maybe it's interesting to knowingly embrace that sometimes, or at least laugh about it instead of suppressing it. In some footnote in that book, Atrocity Exhibition by J.G. Ballard, he says about our notions of conventional reality that it's an artificial construct which serves the limited ambitions of our central nervous system. I think in that particular moment he was talking about like LSD and drugs and how those can be ways of expanding notions of reality. And that's cool and interesting, but I'm also thinking here, like maybe in addition to that, I can explore inside myself how reality gets constructed in the first place and really try to take a look at that in some sort of visceral way. When I was in art school, I studied painting, and in the first few years of learning to draw and paint, I was just studying how to better see things in the real world so that I could recreate them. Before I learned to draw, that's something that I really didn't understand, and that simple fact, I think, opened up a lot of creative potential when I learned it. To be a good drawer, you have to spend thousands of hours staring at things and reproducing them in charcoal or paint. And the more you learn to see, the better artist you become. And then that extends to all things, like seeing patterns in human behavior, to see new ideas and trends, or pull up old ones and make new things around them. And then the better artist you become, and the more clearly you see things, and the less fuzz there is. But sometimes, I don't know, I like the fuzz. At least I find it interesting. I think it reveals a lot about us as humans. Sometimes maybe it's good to not try too hard to become a good artist in some ways, or to maybe unlearn your training, or at least use it in a way you didn't realize you could use it before, like expand on it. Maybe it reminds us that art isn't about having definite answers to anything, and it's more so just about making analogies and reminding us life is really pretty weird and confusing, and no one actually knows what's going on. But that in itself is pretty interesting. Sometimes it's really hard, and also sometimes it's really funny. In this project and in my more recent ones, rather than look at things in the outside world, I wanted to look at the world that I built up inside my head and really try to reproduce some of that. Not just the ideas, but really like the visions, like really looking at them in the same way that I looked at figures in figure drawing class or something like that. One major inspiration for this was William Blake. He did something that I think is kind of similar. He claimed to easily be able to summon spirits from the past and see them. So his friend commissioned him to draw those spirits. He has this set of drawings called visionary heads that are these haunting portraits of historical and mythological figures that look sort of like half-human, half-dream entity or something like that. He would summon these spirits and draw them in the middle of the night with his friend, and those are probably my favorite drawings of all time. And, you know, almost everything in this cosmology here comes from a similar space. It feels sort of like I'm summoning it in a weird sort of like techno updated way as to how Blake did it. While modeling everything for this, I would open up ZBrush, it's a 3D sculpting program, and sort of like doodle with it and just kind of intuitively make creatures that lived in my head, but also partially lived in the software. Like they were what ZBrush wanted me to make. I always feel like I'm sort of collaborating with this software. I think there's a sort of ideology inside software. I don't like it when people refer to it as just a tool. You know, software, it's millions and millions of lines of code written by large groups of workers, and it's so much more complex and multifaceted. And something like ZBrush isn't made for anyone in the same way that a hammer is, you know. The most obvious difference being that it's totally unaffordable, and most people, myself included, have to pirate it to use it. I'd be surprised if anyone at ZBrush could name a living contemporary artist, and I think a lot of people who use ZBrush have a fundamentally different idea or definition as to what art is than I do. You know, it's mostly for large animation studios, product designers, and stuff like that. It wants things to be very like clay-like and symmetrical. So the things I make in there, they end up looking like amalgamations of 90s cartoons and video game characters, but kind of grimy and ugly looking. I don't have a team of people working with me. I do all this on my own, and I have to work quickly. So these are, you know, sort of like the spirits or ghosts that haunt my subconscious in the same way that William Blake drew kings and figures from European history that haunted him. Alright, so a lot of levels in this game the character takes on different forms. So I'll show you this level where she's a colored pencil drawing, playing some sports game with a Neolithic cyborg. I worked with a few different actors on different levels to read some short stories I wrote. So I think when I go to this one right here, I'll let this story kind of play out. Shut up for a minute.
An independent journalist opened up a document on his computer and began to compose his next podcast. He decided the theme would be about the Sankabetsu brown bear incident in Japan in 1915. A group of settlers in Hokkaido were attacked by a giant brown bear that was rudely awoken from its hibernation. The journalist decided to side with the bear and began a long diatribe about Marxist economics, environmental conservation, lack of sleep, 24/7 consumer technology, colonization, and the video game Ghosts of Tsushima. He purchased some royalty-free piano music set to a hip-hop beat that he would use in the intro. While getting a cup of coffee in his kitchen before recording, the journalist noticed an old yam on his microwave that was growing large magenta-colored fractal roots. He also saw a cockroach in a glue trap that was still alive. Its little antennas on its head were moving around. It didn't seem scared. It just seemed like it was thinking, looks like I'm stuck here and I'm going to die. This glue smells pretty good. The journalist asked the cockroach if it feared death. After a few seconds of thought, the cockroach said that it did not believe in death. Once its body stopped working, its consciousness would reconnect with universal cockroach consciousness. Then parts of it would combine into a new cockroach ego that would implant itself into a baby cockroach that would be born behind the journalist's sink.
Almost done. So I guess, yeah, that was a story that was kind of inspired by all the cockroaches in my apartment during the pandemic. We could not get exterminators to come in the building for like a year. So, oh my God, they were everywhere. Every time I opened a drawer. All right, so I think the last level I'll go to is right here. This is actually, this is my apartment where I'm actually sitting and recording right now. It's a one bedroom in Jackson Heights, Queens, and I'll let this monologue go on for a minute and tell the story.
My girlfriend went to visit her family in California and I closed all the curtains and stayed home for 2 weeks. It was the longest I'd ever been totally alone. During the day I made a perfectly scaled 3D model of my living room. At night I smoked weed and played Counter-Strike and System Shock and watched old kung fu movies. Most things I like haven't changed much since I was a teenager. I feel most comfortable mentally living in the time period when I came of age. Most of my dreams still happen in the house where I grew up. My psychological growth is stilted, just my gut keeps growing. When I get drinks with friends they tell me I should do therapy. I told my mom I'm a communist and she told me I need to do therapy. The world feels like it's falling apart. It feels like everyone is losing interest. Why do I have to do therapy? CEOs should do therapy. People who own yachts and multiple properties across the world should do therapy. Everyone I know is starting a family or leaving town or busy with success. I have a really good teaching job where I work, like, 2 days a week for 8 months out of the year. I'm too old to have a kid or switch careers now. I don't really know what I'm doing with my life.
So, yeah, I like this fake quote that gets thrown around a lot on the internet and in books that says there are other worlds, but they're in this one. Some attribute it to the French poet Paul Éluard. I don't know. To me, it's a handy expression that keeps me a little grounded while building out these worlds. Yeah, I have a lot of trouble getting into stuff that's more fantasy than sci-fi, I guess, like Star Wars or Harry Potter or all the comic book movies. I feel like there's just like nothing to grab onto or relate to me, and the characters and places just seem so like perfect, more like they were made in a marketing meeting rather than by an artist or a group of artists. It seems really obvious to say, but I feel like I always need to remind myself that everything around me, it didn't just come out of nowhere. You know, the computer I'm on, the software that's running it, the internet, as I was saying about ZBrush. This stuff was made by large self-interested corporations, and a lot of the core features and protocols were funded and developed by the US military. It's always so wild to me that the first thing we did with a digital computer was run atomic bomb simulations and figure out how to decimate hundreds and thousands of people instantly. And then just a few decades later, we're using that same core technology to do cheesy special effects in Hollywood movies. I mean, it's an absolutely insane space to make art in when you step back and think about it. It's just so wild that when you use it to build out your worlds, to totally ignore that in the world you're building, it just seems like too intentional or something. It seems weird thing to do. Even the materiality of digital art is so strange. I think it's easy to feel that art made on a computer is immaterial, but that couldn't be further from the truth. I don't know for sure, but it seems like a digital video on YouTube or Vimeo or something uses more energy and space than an oil painting. It has little teeny physical spaces all over the world and giant climatized warehouses rather than one place on a wall somewhere. And for me, this is important to not lose track of the materiality of what I do when I'm on a computer. Our material conditions are what shape our thoughts, right? I mean, the exterior world builds on the interior one. It's not the other way around. I always try to remember that, a few great men don't influence our actions and thoughts. I don't think any solutions or answers to anything come from a single person, almost ever, It's our collective material conditions that shape us, and a few terrible men have robbed and pillaged most of that at this point for themselves and love buying up almost the entire media infrastructure to make sure that the last thing that should be on anyone's mind is redistributing their wealth. And I don't know, that's almost certainly what needs to happen, but it almost certainly will not anytime soon, unfortunately. And none of us want the world that we have, but we just keep participating in it. This confusion and absurdity, it drives my work a lot, and it's always coming out in the cosmologies I'm making. I think a large percentage of people would say that the society we built up is not so great for most who live in it, but we just keep doing the same thing over and over, and we can't stop. It's pretty fascinating. Okay. A definition of humans I like is from that book Sapiens. It says that what makes us unique, what enables us to group in larger numbers than any other species, is our ability to believe in things that are not real, like money. Money is not real. We all just agree that it is, and it holds incredibly strong power over us. Corporations and governments and nation states, those aren't real either. It would be amazing if we could start having new options for stuff to believe in, because the current things are really, really boring and destructive and benefit a very small percentage of people. And I hope my work in any tiny way can nudge us in new directions of belief. Maybe just to believe that we can do things differently and things can be more exciting and inclusive and weird, you know? So I think this is a good spot to stop. This game, it's on Steam if you have a gaming PC. It's just $4. There's still a ton more to explore. The whole thing takes a few hours to finish. And also there's a simulation component that can just run forever. So anyway, thanks so much for checking this out, and thanks again, Gray Area. Here are the credits. Just let those run for a minute, and I will see you later. Thank you so much.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We're live with Jeremy, who just gave us a wonderful tour through his game Fuzz Dungeon, which is currently available on itch.io. I dropped some links in the chat. You can go to itch.io and search Fuzz Dungeon. It'll come right up. And it definitely absorbed a couple of my Friday nights this summer. Jeremy, so this is a monumental project. I mean, any game work is a monumental project.
Yeah, it is.
And, I'm wondering, in your process, how do you get started in creating these worlds? I mean, I wouldn't even know where to begin.
Well, it always starts with different ideas. I had such a different idea for this project originally. I really liked that, I guess, like almost poetically, I like that term, dungeon crawler, or like roguelike dungeon crawler or whatever. But I don't even like those games. I just like that term. So I was like, I want to make one of those, but it'll be like way different. But then as I got into it, it just totally went in a million other directions. Like that character Flip in the game, she used to be able to like crawl around and do all this other stuff, but it's just like it just wasn't working, and it changed around a lot. And honestly, I don't know, it just ended up being sort of like about my time during this pandemic, not in a direct way, but just in a sort of indirect way, just different thoughts and things that were happening during that like period of sort of isolation and stuff.
I think it's super interesting also the connection that you make with world building, generally speaking, but also with how you approach architecture. I think there's a lot of conversation in regards to the space itself and how you represent and move within this space. And I think a lot of metaphors can be seen there. And I just kept on thinking about this quote by J.W. Mitchell, I think, who at some point during the early 90s said something like, the internet is the first contender of architecture because it's probably one of the first new spaces, let's say, that you are, in a way, creating new other spaces that in any other way you may be building through architecture. But I kept on thinking how that was in part true, but then in part it was not true because, of course, video games already did that. Perhaps not as expanded as we can understand the internet doing this, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, on how this connects also with these other ways of creating or making a space for something. Because it's not, let's say, of course, when we think about video games, we think about playing, right? We think about this action or, I don't know, like this connection very specifically to one area of activity. However, video games and being and living and exchanging through video games is not only playing as such. So yeah, I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
I think definitely for me, video games aren't so much about playing, it's just exploring. And I like that you bring up architecture. I mean, I can't even pretend to know really anything about architecture. But I do know about, what it's like to inhabit a space and what it's like to feel in a space. I remember, like, I guess when you were asking that question, one thing I thought of is like some of my earliest memories as like a kid and realizing that the world is weird or just doesn't make sense or something. I was thinking like, why don't we have like ball pits and slides and like stuff and like fireman poles in our homes? Like those are so much more fun than other things. And I was like really troubled by that. Like, why why don't adults do that? It's so much better. And so I guess like the cool thing is once you start to get into these game engines is you can actually build those worlds that you wanted that are kind of like absurd but fun. But it's playful in that regard, yeah. But it's like nothing in my games has like, I mean, there's like high scores, but it's like a joke. It's almost like sometimes I think of my games as analogies of games instead of actual games almost, where it's just you're really just like exploring these spaces.
Yeah, and that feels really true in your games mechanically. I mean, there's so much yeah, there are like mini games and high scores. I mean, we saw the soccer, we saw the kind of soccer game being played, and but there's never the score never adds up to anything or anything that makes sense for you, and through that. It's an interesting metaphor, as you strive for these numbers or to complete the task or X, Y, and Z, like that really just becomes a vehicle for experiencing the story, a vehicle to push you to explore in different ways. And I'm wondering, you talk a lot about absurdity and how that is a way that helps you to understand the world around us. And we were talking the other day, about how right now is such an absurd time in the world, and there's so your work really captures this feeling of confusion and disillusionment that I think is really being felt by a lot of people right now. I'm wondering, in that, what do you want players to take away from your games, after they play them? Beyond just imparting your own, your experience and kind of musing on some of these things, like how do you want to make them feel?
Ideally, I mean, maybe this is a little hyperbolic, but I just want people to feel that they had an experience, kind of like not as intense as when you're coming down off like mushrooms or something like that. That's a little bit much, but just some sort of like feeling that like, oh my gosh, like I just went through a thing. Maybe more like when you wake up from a weird dream, like something like that, and to just realize or just like have a notion that, a reminder, I guess, that life is so much weirder than we act like it is on a day-to-day basis, Like we get so caught up in so many dumb things throughout the day that don't really matter, and I'd like people to come away just kind of laughing about that, I guess, And I always like, one thing I think that's important to me is I'm trained as an artist. I have a master's degree in art, but then I'm in this game space. And I think both those worlds kind of need each other or like could use more of each other, I guess. I think sometimes the art world takes itself way too seriously, which makes it kind of like boring and it makes it harder for a lot of people to access, a lot of people feel very intimidated by it, which is terrible because there's so many amazing artists that I think anybody could enjoy. And then games have a really different definition of art, period, and like how art functions in the world. I think there's, for me anyway, like from what I learned in school and stuff, from Matthew Ritchie, who was one of my mentors, he has a definition of art I really like, that it's an analogical space where you recreate old ideas, recuperate old ideas, or generate new ones, right? And so it's like, that's to me what art is. It's an analogical space, but I think people in games, their definition of art is essentially like design or something. Like if you go on ArtStation, where game artists are, there's like ogres and hunk wizards. Like it's like, to me that's stuff's really cool, but I don't know what analogies they're making or new ideas are coming out of that. And so I think the game space could use a bit more of that to make it more interesting. So yeah, I think I went off on a tangent. I don't even remember what your question was.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense, and especially now, I think that there's a very powerful, area of exploration when we talk about the absurd as well. And this, it's a particular scenario, I suppose, but at least for the past 10 years, we've lived through a series of, like absurd situations over and over and over and over and over. And it feels it's just a chain of the absurd, pouring out of wherever. And And I just keep on thinking about how sometimes, in order for us to actually try and imagine something that feels necessary to, I don't know, to end a situation that urgently needs to be rethought or restructured, I think that sometimes the absurd can be probably the only place that allows us to do that because it
Yeah.
feels full of possibility, I guess.
Oh,
And
that's such a good point. I love that. Yeah, I love talking about the absurd, and you all have these things on your face.
obviously,
I'm
because
laughing.
I
Yeah,
take myself very seriously,
it's
as you
great.
can see.
Right, right. That's so perfect. That's so perfect.
And I mean, I don't know. Well, at first, my first question that was in regards to architecture, and you were saying like, well, I don't know much about architecture. Well, for me, it's very funny because I did a BA in architecture, so
Oh
I
yeah.
do know a thing or two
Yeah,
about
yeah.
architecture.
Nice.
And probably, what at some point connected me to the world of the arts, let's say generally speaking, was actually these spaces of possibility to just one day wonder what would happen if someone that's not an architect was using AutoCAD for doing other things, for instance. Like, what other interesting stuff can be done with these tools, because they're already there, and it's quite plain and quite boring, and of course I can do floor plans with these for the rest of my life, but what else can we do with that? And I think that sometimes it feels like we have a lot of tools, but just not the, I don't know, sometimes the impulse, or I know the general push for us to wonder what would happen if we use that in a different way. And I think that in your work we could definitely see that, like, this
Oh,
is
thank
a
you. Thank you.
possibility.
Yeah, I
So,
think that's what I'm trying to think about, and why I love using these game engines that like Fortnite. The game engine I use is Unreal Engine, and they essentially create it for Fortnite, right? Which is like a billions and billions of dollar game, and I love that it's open source and like anyone can use it and totally just mess around with it, and do this weird kind of stuff that maybe it wasn't meant to be used for, or like certainly I don't think anybody at like Epic Games or whatever cares about this stuff or like knows or wants to know what it is. I don't know. But yeah, I don't. We're in such an interesting moment where maybe we're in like some sort of new dark age. I don't know, where like our imagination is really suffering now or something. Like we're on iPhone 13 and PlayStation 5, and like how many more iterations of these things are we gonna have? I was just, yeah, and like I don't know. Yeah, I'll stop there. I could go on.
There's one thread of your work that I think particularly speaks to me. Is there's a lot of really heavy critique of capitalist modes of extraction, of corporate work environments, of expectations for laborers. For instance, in Fuzz Dungeon, there's a level of the game where you're kind of falling through levels of this factory, or but it's like a corporate factory, like producing corporate workers, sort of. I mean, that maybe that's the wrong way to describe it. And you kind of there's an audio piece that kind of talks about the relationship between labor and artistic production and value. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit on those points, and what kind of things you're trying to wrestle against in this work.
Yeah, that particular level, I was just thinking about the types of like entertainment I consume, and I was like wondering why I like those things so much. And a lot of times, it's embarrassing, but whatever. A lot of the stuff I watch is just comedies about men who refuse to grow up. It's like, it's just Trailer Park Boys. I forget what I mentioned in there. Some movie where just about some dumb guy. Because like maybe in part these shows have these people that would rather just be like petty criminals than have their labor be exploited in some shitty job. And there's something like appealing but kind of like funny about that. And also I like thinking about there's this thing David Graeber was saying in some article on bullying. It's a quote that just really sticks with me, where he's like, when we talk to someone and tell them you should like have ideals and morals, we say be humane, right? Like be humane, treat people kindly. But then when we fail to live up to those things, we say, oh, I'm only human. So it's like, you know, to be a human being is to like have ideals, but also to fail to live up to them. So like, that's another thing I think about a lot is like, I have all these ideals, but you know, I also live in this world and I have to like pay rent and stuff. And to do that, I essentially have to fail to live up to my ideals, which is like absurd and like a fairly frustrating thing, you know. But yeah, and then making the art, you're trying to find some way to have both those things, but it's tricky and it's never precise or like I could never pretend that I'm totally perfect or anything like that. If that does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
No, I think, you know, that to me, you know, I think that your games speak to me in their absurdity because, you know, the idea that I sit at a computer in one place and I type words to people all day, you know, like that's absurd to me. Like that's such a crazy thing. And there's so much about like the mundanity, is that a word? Of the mundaneness of our lives, that is just crazy. And it just kind of never fails to like shock me that, you know, people are willing to do the things that they do in order to survive, or have to do the things that they do in order to survive. Maybe they don't want to do them. I mean, there's plenty of things I don't want to do. And I'm just wondering, you know, we've kind of touched on this, but just to go in a little bit deeper, I really want to understand, you know, how you use absurdity as a vehicle to understand these kind of incomprehensible truths or feelings about, you know, what it's like to be human.
I mean, I don't know. Can you elaborate a little more?
Yeah, I mean, you know, because when I play your games, it really feels like, you know, like you said, you're asking a lot of questions, and it really feels like you're trying to get to the bottom of something in a lot of ways. Like you're wrestling with these things that are confusing and wild and just bizarre and hard to wrap your head around. And you know, I wanted to just get some input on like, you know, how, like what the result is for you from this kind of exploration of the absurd, like how, by like thinking about these things, by activating these different thoughts. For instance, in the show, in the piece in Diorama, there's a quote that says, can you imagine Karl Marx sitting on the toilet taking a shit and looking at Reddit on his phone? And these are just these like, you know, moments that are just hilarious and like weird to think about, but that somehow capture a feeling really well. And it's, I don't know. I feel like there's something that must be generative from that for you. And I want to know if, I don't know, does that sound?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess one thing that comes to mind from your question is like, you know, a big part of me is materialist, right? Like I'm, you know, communist or whatever. Like I'm very progressive, I guess, you know. But then another part of me is like, well, I want to be also spiritual, which is the opposite of that, and like an idealist, and that's like completely opposite of those things. So I guess in making art, I'm grappling a little bit with like trying to find a way to be spiritual and trying to find a way to like think about what else life could be other than just physical matter. Like there's got to be more to it, right? We can't possibly understand everything that's going on because it's just so bizarre. And so I guess in a way it's a little bit spiritual, if that makes sense. So I think I come out of it with trying to like just remind myself about that life is very mysterious and strange. I mean, you know, Homo sapiens, we've been around for a little 250,000 years or something like that. And we've only been making art for like not even, you know, a quarter of that maybe. And we've had like social media accounts for 0.001% of that. Like, you know, our minds are not at all made for this world. And it's just, so I'm just trying to find a way to live in it and like make sense of it and have some sort of peace with it, I guess. I don't know. Or it's just like think about other things, that other possibilities, which is important. I think we have to find new things to believe in, like I was saying, and that's probably going to come out of these weird experiences.
I find it very interesting that you connect with the spiritual part through this whole conversation, because I kept on thinking about this term techno shamanism as seen through the lens of Latin American artists and researchers, and particularly through Fabiane M. Borges, who, well, she has this very, very heavy research in regards to techno shamanism in Brazil. And one of the things that at some point I read that really struck me was when she was comparing the ways in which certain people within certain indigenous communities were understanding the internet, particularly the internet. So there was this part where she said something like, well, the first thing that came up within this conversation was that connecting to the internet was a sort of ritual. So it was pretty much a very similar thing to doing a shamanic ritual where you would disconnect from your body to connect with the consciousness of other people that might be present in the nearby, let's say, space, but then also that can be present within other areas, whether that be geographically speaking or within time, right? So it is sort of like a time travel teleportation sort of experience. And when she was having this conversation with several shamans from these indigenous communities, they were like, well, it's very similar, because what you are doing is that you are connecting through a device, this artifact, which with you have this sort of ritual where you would connect with other consciousness that are not necessarily right in front of you physically, but that you can get through or talk with or share with through this device, right? And I thought that just blew my mind, because I had never really thought about it in that way. And for them, in that sense, it was a very spiritual way of connecting with others, right? I mean, of course, it depends on how we use the internet, right? But I think that this notion of, yeah, it's sort of like a ritual that you do, and you connect with other consciousnesses, I suppose that's through this sort of ritual where you get, well, not necessarily rid of your body, but you disconnect from the usual way that you would connect with others. And I think that is something that is very powerful and definitely ties very closely with what we were talking about, because it sounds at some point very, I don't know, like magical, and at some point even a bit absurd if you were living before the internet and you had no idea that this was coming, but now is something that is just absolutely normal, part of, our daily lives, or
Right.
At least within this conversation. And it still sounds crazy when you describe it with other words, even though we're doing
for sure.
just that.
Yeah, it sounds like mystical almost. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I like this idea of consciousness and just thinking about what consciousness is. I think that's probably the more spiritual side of what I think about when I do this stuff. And just this idea, I really like this book by this psychiatrist, I think, Julian Jaynes. And he writes a lot about the origin, like what he thinks is the origins of consciousness. But he thinks consciousness, that we develop consciousness as we know it now by metaphors. Like we have this like metaphorical self of who we are in our head. We have metaphors that are essentially like language, right? And like when we start learning to say like this is like that, in a sense, our consciousness expands, right? And like I see it like in my niece right now, like she can't speak yet, and she's slowly starting to learn like compare things, right? And develop a sense of herself. And maybe that's why to an extent we don't have memories too when we're that young, because we have no language and no capacity for metaphor. And so like the more we're able to say this is like that, the more our consciousness can expand. Maybe it's a cool idea. I don't know. And then art, that's why art can be so spiritual and important, because it's a way for our consciousness to expand. The more comparisons we make to things, maybe the better we can see and grow.
Jeremy, that's such amazing advice to end on. We're just about out of time. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all
for
so
sharing
much.
for sharing your inner psyche with us through these games.
Yeah.
Again, folks, these are not works you can look at. They're works you have to experience and interact with. So please head to Jeremy's itch account and check them out. You can also go to newart.city/show/diorama to see the special presentation that Jeremy made, pulling pieces from various games to give us a unique window into his work for our show. So thank you so much, Jeremy.
Well, thank you, Wade and Dorian. It was super meaningful to be a part of this. Awesome job. So happy.
Well, Jeremy, like I need more games. Like let's talk labor, let's talk production, because I've got time on my hands and I've got games to play. So
I know. Oh my gosh. I'm already a year into my next one. It'll probably be another year at least.
oh well, we're looking forward to seeing what you put for us next.
Thank you all so much. Looking forward for the next talks too.
Bye.